You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Ever since Yevgeny Prigozhin marched on Moscow in his ill-fated rebellion against Russia's military leadership, it was hard not to imagine his remaining days on Earth were numbered. After the uprising, Putin went on live television and vowed to brutally punish Prigozhin. The fate of our people is decided, he said. The mutiny was a treason and a stab in the back to the people of Russia. When the Wagner group turned around and marched to Belarus, and their leader was granted amnesty, it didn't exactly make the Russian president look strong and in charge. So when a plane believed to be carrying Prigozhin fell from the sky near Moscow at the end of August, many were not surprised. But it was curious when photos and videos of Prigozhin's burial showed swarms of Russian police closely guarding his private service in a cemetery on the outskirts of St. Petersburg. The presence of troops seemed to suggest that even as a dead man, Prigozhin could still worry Putin. Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian Anne Applebaum wrote about this spectacular act of violence in her column for The Atlantic. She now joins us to discuss the consequences of what many are calling an assassination and whether this act was a show of strength or symptomatic of Putin's decline. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Right after watching the plane said to be carrying Yevgeny Prigozhin and senior Wagner personnel hurtling from the sky in flames, you said a new era of brutality may be opening in Putin's Russia. What went into that conclusion?
A lot of people have died under very strange circumstances ever since Vladimir Putin was first the head of the FSB, the Russian security agency that followed the KGB. Democratic activists were gunned down in their stairwells in St. Petersburg. The journalist Anna Politkovskaya was also killed in her stairwell in Moscow. Boris Nemtsov, who was a democratic leader, was killed a few steps away from the Kremlin. Alexei Navalny was poisoned and nearly died. These were all open enemies of the Kremlin, but since the war began a year and a half ago, there have also been quite a number of accidental deaths of people who have somehow crossed Putin or disagreed with Putin. They've fallen down the stairs or they've fallen out of windows or they've met mysterious deaths in other ways. Prigozhin was different, though, because Prigozhin was not an opponent of Putin. Prigozhin supported Putin. Prigozhin's Wagner group, this was his mercenary group, was essentially running Russian foreign policy in Africa. He created new openings for Putin. He did deals with dictators there. He was opening diamond mines and gold mines and sending the profits back to Russia. He ran the internet campaign on behalf of Donald Trump in 2016. This is somebody who had been really an integral part of Putin's inner circle and an integral part of his politics and his view of the world. To have him fall afoul of Putin following his attempted rebellion, his insurrection 2 months ago, was something very different and new. We haven't had an insider like that oppose Putin, and we haven't seen Putin in turn use violence against somebody quite like that. I suppose I should add a caveat, because we don't know for certain that Putin took down Prigozhin's plane, but it certainly seems like the most likely explanation.
Why not just a shot across everybody's bow? After Putin was speculated to have been weakened by the mutiny, by the stunning and odd images of an armored column rolling north toward Moscow from the Ukrainian border, why did you conclude that this sort of changes the game and anybody's fair game now? Isn't this the kind of thing that just makes everybody more cautious and more likely to toe the line?
So certainly it makes people more cautious and likely to toe the line, but it also means that anybody who has had any disagreement with Putin or anybody who was dealing with Prigozhin, and there are many people who were, anybody who was benefiting from any of his relationships, whether in Africa or the Middle East or Ukraine, there's a whole group of people now who are extra inclined to be very careful and maybe to try and find ways to fight back. We now have a situation where Putin has arranged the plane crash of probably his most effective military leader, certainly the one who was responsible for the only victory of the past year, the taking of the town of Bakhmut. He has jailed another commander who was close to Prigozhin, who is another one of the few successful military leaders in Russia. And he's begun jailing some of the so-called nationalists. These are the Russian bloggers and propagandists who have been supporting Prigozhin and have also been supporting his attack on the military leadership of Russia, the defense minister and the kind of mainstream leaders of the army. And so that's not a good look. I mean, when the dictator is forced to jail or kill or otherwise remove senior members of his circle, that's not a sign of stability and calm at the heart of the regime.
Right after the climb down by Prigozhin, the so-called negotiated settlement with Lukashenko, the standing down of the Wagner column that rolled north toward Moscow, I wondered why Prigozhin was still alive on day 2. But it turns out only my timing might have been off. But in the weeks since all of that went down, have you been able to fill in the picture to your own satisfaction of what that was all about, how it even happened?
You mean the rebellion, the strange march on Moscow? The best explanation I've heard is that Prigozhin, this was a moment when the Russian military was beginning to shut down Prigozhin's operation. They were trying to force Wagner fighters to join the regular army. They seemed to be cutting off some of Prigozhin's access. And Prigozhin himself had been very loud and very critical of that leadership. And so they felt there was some kind of direct competition with him. And it seems that he believed that he had enough support inside Russia from others, maybe from Surovikin, this other general who has recently disappeared, maybe from others in Rostov or elsewhere in the military setup. He must have believed that he had enough support from them that a protest of that kind, taking Rostov and marching on Moscow, would convince Putin to hand back to Prigozhin all of his privileges and all of his access, and would also convince him to end the leadership or overthrow the leadership of the army. He must have had some reason to believe that he would achieve that by making that gesture. He thought he would go and take over the army and put its true leaders in charge and end the false leadership of these bureaucrats and time servers, which is how he would describe the Minister of Defense. And as I say, he believed somebody would come to his aid. But once he was there, once he was on the road to doing it, it seems that whatever he expected to happen didn't happen.
Though, in Rostov, it was amazing to see people high-fiving Prigozhin, slapping him on the back, not empty streets and a population in fear of the consequences of this audacious move, but a place on the road to Paris, as it were, like after Napoleon got off of Elba. And there he is. He's got a certain amount of popular support, doesn't he?
You're right. That to me was the most remarkable part of the whole day, that he walked into the Rostov military district, which, by the way, is from that collection of buildings that the war in Ukraine is being run. He walked in, nobody objected to him. They parked their armored vehicles outside. They went to get coffee. There are these photographs of them walking across the street carrying coffee cups first thing in the morning. Nobody pushes them away. No one objects to them being there. And as you say, during the day, sort of ordinary people come down to see them, that talk to them, they buy them ice cream, they buy them bottles of water. By the time they leave late in the evening, people are cheering and waving and taking selfies and so on. So here you have a violent mercenary figure coming to overthrow the state. And rather than reacting with horror and patriotic shock, people seem to rather welcome it, which I think there are two things to say about. One, you're right. Prigozhin had a kind of populist language. It's me, the ordinary guy, standing up for ordinary soldiers against this kind of corrupt military brass that obviously appealed to people. But I think we were also seeing something else. Putinism and Putin's power is a great beneficiary of apathy. Russian propaganda kind of encourages and seeks to increase apathy. It tries to persuade people not to be involved in politics. It tries to confuse them about what's going on, so they're not really sure what's true. It tries to persuade people to stay home, don't protest, don't join, don't take part, let us figure everything out. And I think the apathy also means that if Putin himself were in danger, I don't think people would be that bothered. As I said, here came a violent leader from the war zone to overthrow the system, and people sort of were mildly entertained to see him there, and they applauded him. Because the apathy is both apathy prevents them from protesting against the regime, but it would also prevent them from protesting in favor of it.
In the days since the plane crash, the identification of the body, sort of going through the motions of a normal state, the strange, sorry, not sorry condolences to Prigozhin's family, the muted coverage of his funeral. You've been studying disinformation and propaganda heavily in recent years. You may be amused to find out that my wife, who's not a reporter, we were listening to the first bulletin, and she turned to me and she said, "What makes you think that's him?" And I thought, well, boy, that's where we are in 2023, isn't it?
So my observation, actually, right after the plane crash, when the Russian aviation agency announced the passenger list and Prigozhin was on the list, my reflection was, in any other country, if a plane crashes and the aviation authorities announce who was on the plane, that's it. We assume they're dead, right? I mean, there's no second guessing or game playing or wondering whether that was really them or not. But you're right. Obviously, actually, in this case, from the first moments that the crash happened, people questioned, was he really on the plane? There was meant to be another plane. Maybe he was really on that plane. Maybe he had staged the crash in order to hide his own death so that he could escape to, I don't know, the Central African Republic where he has friends and escape from Putin. Maybe Putin had reasons. Like, almost immediately, as soon as the crash happened, there began to be these conspiracy theories about whether it was him or not and who really did it and was it, and so on. I mean, my instinct, just for what it's worth, is that he was on the plane, just because enough people close to the Wagner group, enough of the bloggers close to that group seem to have been genuinely distressed. And he appears to be genuinely missing. And even the fact of them covering up the location of the funeral, which did happen, and sort of hiding where the funeral ceremony was going to be and all that, that makes me think it's real. In other words, they wouldn't be covering up a fake Prigozhin. But for a real Prigozhin, obviously they're worried about him becoming a martyr or a hero. They didn't want to attract a crowd to the funeral. They didn't want too much discussion of his death and why he died. And so they kept it quiet. I mean, to the extent that the funeral was meant to be in one place, but it really took place somewhere else. And almost as soon as he was buried, or as you say, the coffin supposedly containing his body was buried, dozens of soldiers were sent in to guard the spot and so on. So all of that, the kind of hysteria around the funeral, to me is an indication that it's probably real. But you are right that in this case, because of the Russian government's propensity to lie and because their fondness for massive cover-ups and games and tricks, there will be people for a long time who think this was some kind of fake event.
Is that part of the logic of the way modern Russia sees the use of information? Not necessarily to lie, to create mistaken impressions, not necessarily to tell the truth, to tell people what's real, but to leave a population really never quite sure what the truth is.
I think that's exactly the point, and that was what I was getting to a few minutes ago when I was talking about apathy. If you offer people 15 different conflicting explanations of something they've just seen, there's a famous example of this is the crash of the Malaysian airliner over eastern Ukraine in 2014. That plane crashed, and almost immediately there were just dozens of absolutely contradictory explanations of what had happened, sometimes appearing on the same news program 20 minutes apart. We do know in that case what happened. The plane was shot down by Russian army troops who thought they were hitting a Ukrainian plane. But the point of that kind of cover-up is it makes people feel, I just have to have some distance from this story. I have no idea what happened. I will never know what happened. And it's better that I don't even think about it too much. And that is exactly the tactics that the Russian state uses. We offer people conflicting explanations, some of the time aggressive propaganda in one direction, sometimes in another direction. And by the end of the day, people are meant to be confused. They're meant to assume life is full of great mysteries they'll never understand. They're meant to assume they can never figure out what the truth is. And of course, if you don't know what the truth is, then you can't fight for it, right? I mean, you can't say, I'd rather be living in a better society, or I'd rather be living in a society with higher economic growth, because you don't know what economic growth is and you don't have any basis for comparison. And maybe the state telling you that you're really quite a lot better off than people in Western Europe convinces you. So yes, I think that's part of the game.
It's been interesting, given everything you just said, to watch a new generation of Russian YouTubers flood the zone in the months after the invasion of Ukraine, showing day-to-day life, talking to people on the street, and unfortunately, given what you just said about wondering whether anything is real, I sit in my office in Washington and watch the TV and think, who is this person? Why are they saying these things to this guy? Why is he still able to post? Somebody must know what he's saying. A guy who walks through an enormous shopping center showing how empty it is and how many stores have closed and how many places have been rebranded because international brands will no longer sell in Russia and so on. And I think layer upon layer upon layer, who's lying to me? Is this guy for real? And I guess that's a 2023 quandary too.
Yes. We are in a strange moment in Russia where actually, through most of Putin's rule, starting back in 2000, there was a certain amount of press freedom and freedom of speech allowed in Russia. So Russia was not a totalitarian dictatorship in the old-fashioned sense of the word. And in that sense, Putin's Russia, for most of the time, has been quite different from the Soviet Union. And the idea was that people can say what they want as long as not too many people are listening. So state television, which is the most powerful medium in Russia still, and which is still the thing that most people watch, was very tightly controlled, and what could be said on television was very limited. But intellectuals in Moscow or people running little niche magazines or newspapers, or up to a point, niche YouTube channels were allowed to do it. I mean, there was a kind of almost a sort of set of unwritten rules about people in that condition were allowed to say what they wanted. In the last 2 years, and especially since the war began, the rules have begun to change. And the truth is that nobody knows really what the rules are anymore. I saw an old Russian colleague who's in the US at the moment, who's somebody who escaped Russia right at the beginning of the war. And we were talking about her and whether she can go back there and so on. And one of the things she said to me was, I don't know what the rules are. She is somebody who's printed things critical of the government. And as I say, in the past, some of that might have been allowed or might have been okay, but maybe it's not anymore. And her essentially lawyers are telling her not to come back for that reason. So you have a moment when some things that were allowed seem not to be, and this public space is narrowing. I mean, an additional part of that story, which is related to Prigozhin, is that also since the war began, there's been this community of so-called military bloggers, people posting mostly on Telegram, many of whom have been very critical of the war effort. So particularly after the sort of catastrophic invasion of Kiev in the beginning of the war. And it seemed that they were allowed to go ahead and be critical for quite a long time until the most prominent of them was arrested a few weeks ago. So it's almost as if the regime wanted some outlets to be available, at least for a while, maybe in order to have access or to understand what people were thinking, what soldiers were thinking and what others were thinking. But again, the rules are unclear and many of those things may now shut down.
But as criticisms of the war effort, they are not, to be sure, saying there shouldn't be a war and we shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. A lot of them are saying, how come we haven't won this thing already? What's wrong with the way we're doing this? Isn't that fair?
Yes, of course. I mean, that's what most of them said. It is worth noting that Prigozhin, on the eve of his fatal march to Moscow, did say something that was much more specifically critical of the war itself. He said that it had been launched for corrupt reasons because corrupt people in Moscow wanted to make money out of it. They wanted to steal Ukrainian companies, as they had done in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea. And they saw it as a money-making venture, and, ordinary Russian soldiers were dying for this corrupt project. So he did say that. So some of the criticism, is tending in a deeper direction.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. Our guest is Anne Applebaum, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, author, and columnist at The Atlantic. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I want to talk to you a little bit about the war, sort of asking as a proxy for Americans who are trying to figure out what's going on. One day you'll hear this expert from Chatham House and this other analyst from Brussels and another person say, this isn't going okay. This may be a doomed effort. Then the next day you tune in something and somebody who sounds just as authoritative and just as credible says, that's not how these things work. And yes, they are grabbing back territory. And yes, they are probing Russian defenses and figuring out how to prosecute this year's campaign. And if you watch it all, you walk away from all these sources thinking, God, I don't know what to think. Not as simple as a binary, these people are winning and these people are losing, but even trying to get a handle on how it's going. Does anybody know how it's going?
People do know how it's going. I mean, I think that you have to ask yourself what frame you're looking at it in. Imagine that following D-Day and following the Allied progress across France towards Germany, imagine that there had been daily photographs from the front line and drones hovering overhead taking pictures of which soldiers were where, and that we'd had a daily report of how many people died and how many pieces of equipment had been destroyed. We would have had a completely different feeling about that effort, which had a number of bad moments. I mean, there were moments of loss. Many people died. There was the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, there were all kinds of times when it looked like the Germans might fight back or they might still win. Had you watched that war in the 1940s, the way that we're watching this war now, you would have asked the same kinds of questions. You would have looked incomprehensible and complicated. And so I think watching it with the expectation that every day there'll be some clear piece of information is a misunderstanding of how wars are fought, especially large wars on this scale, which really none of us in Europe or the United States has fought since the Second World War. I mean, there's almost nothing I can think of that's comparable to this enormous land, 1,000-mile border, that front line that's being fought over. So be careful of that. The second thing to be careful of is the Ukrainians who have done so many things right, and especially in terms of presenting their case and making arguments and explaining who they are to the world, I think did make one mistake last spring, which is that they oversold the speed with which they could retake territory this summer. And so there were very, very high expectations for what they could do. And some of that was their fault and some of it was the fault of others. But there was an enormous amount of optimism, not just about winning, but about how fast they could win. And so, yes, I do think there was an expectation that there would be some big breakthrough in June or July, and that the war would look completely different by the autumn. The optimism, I think, was wrong. I think people didn't understand what it was going to be like to fight across the kinds of minefields and the kind of tank traps and the kinds of defenses that the Russians had time to create. So if we did do something wrong, I think it was taking too long to start the counteroffensive, because it gave the Russians time to build these kind of underground trenches, enormous, as I said, fields of mines, where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mines. And this is in a part of the country which is very open. So if you're demining a minefield with a large machine, everybody can see it. The drones can see it, the artillery can see it, and so on. So I don't think the difficulties of doing what they're doing were fully appreciated, particularly since they don't have the kind of air force that the U.S. would have if it were doing the same thing.
You've written an excellent history of the Holodomor, the engineered famine in Ukraine itself. Watching what Russia has done to Ukraine over the last year and a half, it is hard to imagine, as you sort of riff through the hundreds of possible outcomes for this terrible war, one where the Ukrainians relent and become a Belarusianized people, a people content to live under a Russian umbrella. It's just kind of hard to imagine them relenting, hard to imagine them willing to become a vassal state of modern Russia, given the hatred that's been sown just since February of last year. I mean, not that there was a ton of love lost before that, but now with Russian speakers learning Ukrainian, with symbols of the old regime being removed and repurposed and reimagined in Ukrainian ways that are distinct and separate, it is really hard to imagine a future where Putin gets an obeisant, cooperative Ukraine on his southern flank.
You're right. It's hard to imagine, and I don't believe it will happen. Maybe it's worth saying that the Ukrainian theory of victory, how they think they can win, is not just about taking back territory. So it's not just about whether they get this village or that village, although they do say that clearly they want everything back. But the real theory of victory, it's not just a theory of victory, it's a theory of how the war ends. The war can only end for good, meaning it's not just suspended for a couple of years, or there's not just a frozen conflict. The war only ends for good when there's a political change inside Moscow, by which I don't mean that Putin necessarily has to leave. The war ends when the Russian elite acknowledges that it was a mistake. In other words, we aren't going to win. Ukraine isn't going to be Russia. This is a colonial war that can't succeed. In other words, the Russians have to come to the same kind of conclusion that the French came to in 1962 when they decided to leave Algeria, which was also at that time a kind of momentous decision, and it affected power in Paris, and there was a coup d'etat attempt, and somebody tried to kill Charles de Gaulle, and so on. So it was a very important politically in France, but it was a decisive break with the colonial idea. Now, Algeria is a separate country. It's not part of France, which it had been thought of, or it had been officially described as before. When the Russians get to that moment, we will know. I can't tell you how we will know, but there will be a withdrawal, there will be a willingness to change, there will be a collapse of some kind on the front line, there will be a shift. Maybe there will be a leadership shift in Moscow, I don't know. Or maybe Putin, as we discussed at the beginning of the program, with his ability to simply recreate reality, will simply announce a new reality. And the new reality is that the war was very successful and now it's over, something along those lines. So the Russians have to recognize the folly of the war. Then it will be possible to end it. The difficulty right now, to be very clear, is that even if we put pressure on the Ukrainians, even if the Ukrainians wanted a break, even if the Ukrainians wanted to negotiate right now, there is no one to negotiate with. The Russians are not negotiating. They have not said, we've given up on our main goal. They have not said, Ukraine is an independent country. They're still saying that they want to conquer and control all of Ukraine. And so it's only when they give that up that there becomes any possibility of ending the war. And the Ukrainians think that the only way to persuade them to get to that point is through some kind of military victory. It may be cutting off Crimea. It may be the reconquest of Mariupol. It may be, there are different kinds of goals that Ukrainians think could be significant. And they're working on trying to attain some of them. And one of the reasons why you've seen a number of drone strikes and other kinds of attacks inside Russia, attacks across the border in northern Ukraine, one of the reasons that's happening is that the Ukrainians now believe they need to bring the war home. In other words, they need to convince ordinary Russians, but also elite Russians, that this just isn't worth it. The price being paid is too high. And so you're going to see over the next couple of months, the Ukrainians do a lot more make a lot more efforts in that direction. I mean, they talk about kind of black swan events, which I think by definition means you can't plan them, but unexpected surprise events and attacks that are designed to make the Russians change their minds. And that I think you'll see more of coming soon.
There is a political dimension to this because while you note, and correctly, that people coming to the television to check in on the war may not be getting what they want in the West, their impressions of whether they're willing to continue to support the Ukrainian project depends on whether they think this is worth it. To them as taxpayers, to the United States as a country, is that solidifying in the United States or a fraught question moving forward as the counteroffensive is slow and laborious instead of lightning and satisfying?
So the polling I've seen does say that U.S. support for Ukraine is connected to the idea that the U.S. wants to support Ukraine's victory. In other words, U.S. support for Ukraine is about Ukraine winning. And so you're right that a feeling of stasis, that we're not going forward, it's not making progress, is quite dangerous to the American public mood. I do agree with that. I could be wrong, but I do think that as long as Biden is president, support will continue. Because for Biden has now attached his name to this project. He went to Kiev to see Zelensky. Zelensky came to Washington. He's invested a lot in it already. By contrast, Afghanistan was not his project. He did not start it. He was against it actually for a long time, even before he became president. He wanted Obama to pull out of Afghanistan. And this is a significantly different project. It's also attached to his claim that he's reinvigorated NATO, which is true. His claim that he's got the Europeans to contribute an enormous amount to the war as well, which is also true, which I think, by the way, isn't discussed quite enough. I mean, I don't know how many Americans realize that we have real allies, and the allies are also offering both military equipment and money to the Ukrainians. And so my instinct is that he will continue to support it. And the danger of the shifting mood or the boredom or whatever it is in the American public will hit sometime next year when we're closer to the presidential election, particularly, obviously, if Biden loses.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, we return with our guest, author Anne Applebaum. She explains how Russian propaganda and disinformation feed off of frustrations on the political right in the United States and offer supposed Russian values as an ideological alternative. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Have you been surprised? Have you been trying to understand why one of the United States' two governing parties, main governing parties, has pivoted in part on its traditional suspicion of Russia, its traditional animus toward Russia, its traditional distaste for leaders like Vladimir Putin, and now it's not really that hard to find people who are either straight up willing to say, I don't care if Russia wins the war, or do a sort of end around on that same point and say, well, the reason Lahaina isn't getting enough aid and the reason why Ohio isn't getting enough aid, East Palestine, is because we're supporting Zelensky's Ukraine. As a Cold War kid, as a kid who spent some of his elementary school under desks waiting for the big one, I've found it just jaw-dropping occasionally to hear the sort of hedgy, grudging unwillingness to be critical of Vladimir Putin. What do you make of that?
I think there are two aspects to it. Number one is pure polarized politics. I think because Joe Biden is fighting this war, then others are against it. I think it's really that simple. I think it's simple as that. If it had been a Republican who was in charge right now, who is fighting the war, then a lot of Republicans would feel differently. And I should also say, a lot of Republicans do feel differently. So the majority of Republicans in the Senate and in the House as well continue to support the war. I was at the Munich Security Conference last February. There was a big Republican contingent there, members of Congress. I heard some of them speak. One case, very movingly, I understand what you boys are doing. There were Ukrainian soldiers in the room. And, if anyone were to invade Texas, I would do the same thing as you. So there was quite a lot of instinctive sympathy as well. And that was from very senior people in the House and Senate. There's a second thing going on, which is that you are right. There is now quite a lot of alignment between Russian propaganda, contemporary Russian propaganda, and a part of the Republican Party's propaganda as well. So the same language about this kind of weaponized traditionalism, in the case of Russia, almost entirely fake. Nobody goes to church in Russia. It's not an especially Christian country. But the idea that what we're really fighting is gays and feminists and the degenerate West, this has a kind of appeal to a part of the American Republican Party, and it's very much pumped up by Russia. So there is an enormous amount of Russian propaganda and Russian influence in the Republican media. Tucker Carlson, I don't know exactly where he gets his information about the war in Ukraine, but sometimes he's come out with very specific, very insider criticisms using the stuff you don't just pick up reading the newspaper. So he clearly has contacts who give him a lot of information about the war from the Russian point of view, and I've heard him repeat it on television. So there clearly are people who are passing on Russian messages, and there's clearly a willingness to hear them. There could be some money involved in this process. I don't know. Certainly there is in other countries. You can find instances of the Russians paying for or supporting political parties and movements. Clearly, as well, some involvement of Viktor Orban's party in the same piece of the Republican Party. They also do propaganda. They also do funding. They also do organizing of conferences and so on. And there's now an overlap between what they do and what the Russians do as well. So there is some kind of alignment between the authoritarian language and image of Putinism and the authoritarian language and image of Trumpism. And that is the other piece of the story, I'm afraid.
In the last days of the Soviet Union, it would have been almost unthinkable to hear a prominent Republican politician get up and talk about how beautiful the country is, or speak well of the Orthodox Church, or as Ted Cruz did, to his very large following on Twitter, rerun a Russian television recruitment ad and compare that favorably to an equivalent in the United States that might, in his version, be concerned with equity and gender roles and God knows what else. It has been fascinating and a little bit breathtaking sometimes to see a kind of odd apologia for Putin's masculinity, for the toughness of Soviet troops, even if that was true in 1978, in 1982, it would have been hard to imagine a senior Republican saying those things to an audience of millions. Social media didn't exist then, but now you can get that, and then it gets resent and resent and resent and refiled and reposted, and it goes to millions of eardrums and millions of eyeballs.
Yes, I mean, particularly given the terrible performance of the Russian army, it's remarkable that it had any admirers at all in our country or indeed anywhere else. I mean, but I think there's another thing going on, which is that Putinism appeals to a part of the American right. And I keep stressing a part because it's not the whole party. It's not the whole right, certainly not the whole conservative movement. But he appeals to a part of it for the same reason that Soviet communism once appealed to a part of the American left. Again, a part, not all of it, a fraction. And that was the people who so dislike their own country and so despair of the state of modern America, catastrophe of our demographics, the decline of the traditional white population, the decline of morals. I mean, however it is you want to describe it, the rise of wokeism, whatever it is that you think is destroying or undermining America. They see they have a kind of ally in Putin, in the way that the far left once saw Soviet communism seemed like an ideal, America's terrible, but at least over there, they're building a kind of paradise. And this is something similar going on here. Well, we have this catastrophic civilizational decline, and over there in Russia, they have masculinity and they have Christianity and they have ethnic homogeneity. Never mind that there's no country that's less ethnically homogenous than Russia. It's not very Christian, and it's probably 12%, 10% Muslim anyway. And there's a part of Russia in Chechnya that's actually run by Sharia law, like genuinely run by Sharia law. So it's a fantasy in the way the left once upon a time fantasized about the Soviet Union. And so it offers people a kind of mythical alternative to our own society.
You mentioned Tucker Carlson. One of the things that he has been very strenuously repeating to his many millions of followers is that Volodymyr Zelensky has been prosecuting and persecuting the Orthodox Church in Ukraine without whispering or cross-hatching Jew in there. It seems to be quietly whispered in the background. There is this narrative that's come bursting out of Zelensky's real problem, it would appear, of having the arm of the Moscow Patriarchate operating in Ukraine and actually working against the war effort and against the established authorities in Kyiv. How much does this stuff really matter to the way the war ends up, any of the way it ends up? These identity markers, rather than hard steel and hard lead and dead troops and trenches and blown up bridges, this kind of stuff about churches and disassociating and remaining affiliate with Kirill in Moscow. I follow this stuff, but I'm not really sure that it's going to matter to the eventual conclusion and the world that goes on between people's ears, who they think they are when this is all over.
So certainly the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's decision to break away from the Russian Orthodox Church, and even just by saying that sentence, I've oversimplified it, but that's more or less what happened, has very profound consequences. And not only is Zelensky not persecuting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, he's celebrated it and helped it. It is true that some parts of the church remain pro-Moscow, and by being pro-Moscow, they are propagandists and advocates for Putinism. And so the Ukrainians have sought to eliminate them as a social force or as a force of influence. That's not at all the same thing as being anti-religion. Very prominent funerals have been very religious. Priests are very much part of the scene and the story in Ukraine. There are actually two churches in Ukraine. There's the two big churches. There's the Orthodox Church, but there's also a form of Greek. It's called Greek Catholicism. There's a Ukrainian Catholic Church as well, a sort of Eastern version of Catholicism, which is more prominent in Western Ukraine, but has also been very important in terms of boosting morale and being part of the story. But I do think that over time, when Ukraine eventually emerges from the war, it will certainly have its two main churches, as well as several other churches, much smaller ones that are there, will no longer be linked to Russia at all. There will be a different, when you go to church, you won't think of yourself as going to participate in some rite that's shared with Moscow. Instead, it will be your own Ukrainian rite in your own Ukrainian language. And I think that will, over time, in the way that the language itself affects how people think about themselves, I think it will matter. Again, it's a subtle thing. You're right, it's not as important as guns and steel, but it's part of what is making Ukraine a clearly separate and distinct nation. Ukraine was a colony of Russia for a very long time. Ukrainians and Russians were part of the same empire twice, the Russian Empire and then later the Soviet Empire. They do share a lot of history. They share a lot of culture. I think actually up until 2014, there was not much enmity between them. I mean, most Ukrainians read Russian. They read Russian books. You'll know if you've been there that large percentage of them are native Russian speakers. They didn't feel themselves to be so distinct and separate. I mean, in the way that Americans share English with the British or with the Irish, they shared Russian with the Russians, as did others, by the way, as did the Belarusians and some Kazakhs and others in the former Soviet world. But this war is really broken that. And the Russian language is now more clearly identified with Putin, with Putinism, and with an autocratic Russian state. And people are beginning to reject the language because of that, as they are rejecting the Russian version of the Orthodox Church.
We're living through an age where a leader who has had half his country's foreign currency wealth seized and frozen abroad, expanded or overseen the expanding of the Nemesis military alliance, gotten a shocking share of his young men hurt and killed. It's been one thing after another, and yet Vladimir Putin seems as much in charge as he's ever been. How, given the way power is hoarded and spent and acquired in that country, given what you know, does that come to an end? Is this a guy who has to retire in order to move from the scene? Or is there a world in which so many people inside the borders of the country can become so fed up that he's neutralized and sent to his massive and fabulous estate under house arrest?
One of the difficulties about predicting any future leadership change in Russia is that not only do we not know who could follow Putin, we don't know how that person will be chosen. There is no succession process. There is no council of elders. There isn't a Politburo. There isn't even a Soviet Communist Party. There is no body of people who can determine how the country is to be led. And Putin has, of course, deliberately eliminated any kinds of institutions that could make a smooth succession process as part of retaining power. But what that also means is that however Putin goes, whether he falls down the stairs, whether he dies in his sleep, whether he is hit by a truck, whatever it happens, the moment that he leaves, there will be a crisis. There will be some kind of power struggle. There'll be some kind of crisis. Maybe it won't be immediate. Maybe it will take longer. Maybe it will take a few days to, or even a few years to play itself out. But the system will have to massively readjust itself. And so one of the reasons we have so much trouble imagining what that future looks like is because Putin has deliberately created a world in which there is no future. You can't think of the future and you can't imagine it. All you can imagine is chaos and crisis. And of course, that's one of the things that keeps him in power. You hear Russians saying it now, if we lose the war, then we lose all of Russia. I mean, actually, no. Why? I mean, why should Russia be destroyed because they lose the war? But there's a kind of catastrophism that if anything happens to Putin, it'll all fall apart. There'll be a civil war. We'll all start killing each other. And Putin himself encourages this fear and this idea. In fact, on the day that Prigozhin was marching to Moscow, it was Putin who went on television and essentially compared himself to Nicholas II, talked about civil war, talked about what happens when Russians kill one another and how dangerous that is. And he created the atmosphere of hysteria around those events as well. And so he's creating this, he wants to create this sense of once I've gone, there's terror that is designed to help keep him in power. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to imagine change. And as I said, I can't predict what will happen, but of course, eventually something will happen. And eventually there will be a change, and then many different kinds of possibilities will open up.
Between the BRICS conference, the tightening relationship with China, some of this stuff seems to obscure just what the numbers tell us about how badly Russia is doing. Is there a moment coming where we'll kind of see it plain, when a Russian has to, just like the worst days of the 1970s or 80s, get on a 5-year waiting list to buy a car from Avtovaz, when you can't acquire the sort of basic toys and tools of a modern office because the country is unable to make it? And if you can't get it right away from China, you can't get it. I mean, there's no shortage of evidence that the system's not really a great system in a lot of ways, that it's not providing for a people who otherwise might be pretty wealthy and comfortable, but instead are in demographic distress, are worried and have every right to worry about the future and don't want their young people necessarily hanging around either. Are we closer to being able to see Russia for what it is, more than we were before the invasion?
Russia is a natural resources-based economy. It is propped up by oil and gas, and its continued ability to sell oil and gas, whether it's to India or to China or whoever else it is, over the last year and a half, have kept the economy afloat. There are plenty of signs that elsewhere in the economy things are not good, that all kinds of industrial production is down. They don't have the parts, they don't have the equipment that they need. There are shortages of different kinds of products. There's beginning to be very high inflation of a kind that will be hard to erase, particularly given how much spending there is now on defense. The defense spending, I should say, is creeping up to kind of Soviet era levels, very, very high percentage of the budget and so on. And that will begin to show in the ordinary lives of Russians, if it hasn't shown already. I mean, I think it has begun to for some people. And it may be that the moment when ordinary people, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg and in the bigger cities, really begin to feel the change, that there will be more energy or more enthusiasm for some kind of political change. Although, again, once again, we run into the problem of mechanisms. I mean, even if there were massive discontent, even if people were starving, even if there was massive unemployment, there is still no mechanism to change the leader. It's not as if just because he's disliked or just because people wanted something else, they could have something different. I mean, that is the definition of autocracy, is that the will of the people has no influence on the government.
Anne Applebaum is the author of The Twilight of Democracy, the seductive lure of authoritarianism, which might be a handy guide to the moment that we're living through. Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, and Iron Curtain, the crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, among others. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. It was produced by Elise Manukian and Andrew Stelzer. Our researcher is Adam Ailey. The program was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.